morning. Welcome to my studio. I'm Debbie Tribble of Dreamweaver Quilting. It's time for another Tuesday Tiny Tip. Today we're going to talk about binding preparation. I'd like to share with you today a few things that I think will improve your binding. So, one thing we want to talk about today is grain line. Grain line is the way the fabric is woven on the loom at the factory. So first of all, cross grain. From selvage edge, which is where often you'll see writing or dots, to selvage edge, across, that's cross grain. Parallel to the selvage edge, up and down, is length of grain. There's one more, and that is bias. So if you cut your strips on the bias, they're going to have quite a bit of stretch. Bias is necessary when you're binding a quilt, such as a double wedding ring or a quilt with scalped edges. The only other time I think about using a bias binding is if I'm working with a stripe. Because when I'm working with a stripe and I cut my strips on a bias, I get a very interesting effect. Just kind of fun, something to know. Here's a little quilt example, was done on the bias. So that's one thing to think about. Today we're talking about cutting on the straight of grain. So as our quilt fabric comes off, and we will fold it, subcut it into sections, and then you'll have your strips. I want you to go ahead and remember to cut the selvage edge off. The selvage edge is where the fabric is attached to the loom when the fabric is being created. It does not respond the same way as the body of your fabric, and when washed or when sewing, it will pull and react differently. So get rid of that selvage edge. Now, on to binding preparation. Once your strips are cut, you might think, oh, I'm just going to take them to the machine, put right sides to, and do a 1/4 inch seam. But that's a fallacy, and here's why. Even if you've pressed that seam open and you fold, as you would to sew it on, and then fold to put the final layer on, you get a big old hump of fabric. That's not going to work very nicely for your binding. So to get around that, let's discuss how you can easily make binding that will be nice and flat as you're preparing it. So I have a strip here, right side up, another strip, right side to the other, so right side down, so they're matched. Now, I have crossed them at a right angle to one another. And I'm going to take a straight edge, and I'm going to mark a seam line so I know exactly where I want to sew. I'm going to sew from this angle right in here. I want to start my stitches here, and I want to end here. That's going to give me a perfect mitered seam so that I don't have bulk. I've got it marked. I would probably take a flower head pin on that side, flower head pin on that side, take it to my sewing machine, stitch right down that mark. And here you can see that's exactly what I've done from the crevice to the crevice. And so now I can take these pins out. I can lay my measuring device on, and I can cut it with the rotary, or I can use the scissors. I just need to get rid of these tails right there, and as I do that, you'll see this is what I'm going to end up with. Now when I fold, I have a seam line here, and I have a seam line over here. The difference. And as I stitch that on my quilt and then bring it around to the back to sew it on, I still have a seam line here, and my seam line is over here. So I don't have that same bulk that I was going to experience with stitching straight on. So use these tips to help make your binding more successful. I hope this has helped you today. Join me again next week for another tiny tip.